Alright guys, welcome back. I don't know about you, but I am kind of happy to see period 7 come to an end. Not that I don't like this time period. In fact, it's one of my favorite time periods in American history. It's just, there's a lot of information here. It's a pretty long topic, and I'm ready to move on to something else. So we're going to wrap up period 7 by looking at topic 7.14, which is titled Post-War Diplomacy. So basically, we're going to look at how the war itself changed how America functions in the world, and also some precedents set by World War II. This is a rather brief topic, so this won't take us very long. And again, this will be our final look at period 7. And we're going to begin by looking at some legacies of World War II and how, again, they affected American foreign policy and our role in the world. And we're actually going to go back to something that happened during the war first. And this is something called the Atlantic Conference. So to connect back to something else we've studied earlier this year, also, by the way, in period 7, you might remember that Woodrow Wilson had a plan he called the 14 points. And the 14 points was his plan to basically make World War I the last war ever needed to be fought. There would be all kinds of border changes and examples of self-determination and free navigation of the sea and all this stuff that would make war like World War I less likely. But of course, we know that didn't actually occur. It happened. World War II happened anyways. Nonetheless, there's an attempt to try to revive this idea of coming with a plan during the war that would help prevent the next great war. And again, this is called the Atlantic Conference, and what it was a meeting between our President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Winston Churchill. Now, this meeting takes place in August of 1941, and if you know anything about your chronology of World War II, you'll know this meeting took place before Pearl Harbor. So America was not even in the war, but Roosevelt is looking at the real possibility of America going to war, getting involved in this conflict one way or the other, and he wants to have some sort of influence on what happens post-war. So he and Churchill meet off the coast of Newfoundland. This was a top-secret meeting. In fact, the press had been told that Roosevelt was going on vacation at sea, taking a little cruise. And he was taking a little cruise, I guess, but he was going to meet Winston Churchill. And there they're discussing some common problems facing their countries, but also what we could do to make the world a better place once this war is over. Now, again, think about this. This is in August 1941. Hitler is still really at the peak of his power, and yet America, who's not even in this war yet, and Britain, who is holding on by the skin of their teeth, are already planning for an Allied victory, and then what would happen as a result of that victory. The most significant thing that comes out of this Atlantic Conference is an agreement known as the Atlantic Charter. There are 8 big points to this, but the one we're going to focus on is the one that has the greatest legacy, and that is the creation of something referred to as a permanent system of general security. And if that sounds kind of familiar to you, it should. This is basically a system much like the League of Nations that came out of World War I, came out of the 14 points. But the League of Nations had failed to prevent World War II, and therefore it needed to be replaced. What comes out of this call for a system of general security is the modern United Nations, or UN for short. So its goal is to replace the League of Nations, which had failed in its attempt to prevent world wars, and the League of Nations basically just folds up. The goal here is the same. Basically, let's provide a forum for the countries of the world to come together, to talk things out, to try to head off problems before they get so big that it results in war. And the thought was, if countries can talk out their problems, there's less likelihood of war. Now, in terms of actual structure of the United Nations, it's in some ways kind of similar to, like, say, our Congress or a parliamentary system where there are multiple houses or different levels. In the UN, there's this thing called the General Assembly. And this is basically every country on Earth who's a member, and virtually all countries are members. They have a seat and a voice in this General Assembly. This is seen as almost like a town hall type meeting where people can voice their concerns and grievances. They can try to ask the United Nations to do certain things. But in terms of actual power, it's very limited. The countries themselves don't really have a lot of power, and the General Assembly itself doesn't necessarily have a lot of power. The real power in the UN lies in the second assembly, known as the Security Council. And this is where the real power lies in the UN. They have the power to authorize the use of force. They have the power to use peacekeepers to try to separate warring factions and keep the peace. And their job is to kind of head off those conflicts before they get too large. Now, the way the Security Council works is there are several so-called permanent members. That would be China, France, the United Kingdom, Russia, and the United States. Obviously, up until 1991, this would have been the Soviet Union. And these 5 members have what's known as veto power. So any one of the 5 permanent members can veto a resolution adopted by the Security Council. So if all the other members of the Security Council say, okay, it's time to use force to stop North Korea from developing nuclear weapons or something, it would only take one of these 5 to say, nope, and then that would not be authorized by the United Nations. Now, there are non-permanent members that are basically rotated through. They're elected through the General Assembly. They don't have veto power, but they can vote in favor of these resolutions that, again, can lead to military force or peacekeeping or whatever they want to do. And so UN peacekeepers are drawn basically from the military of member nations of the UN. So, for example, down here, we have Filipino soldiers, but they are there acting as peacekeepers for the United Nations, wearing the distinctive blue helmets. In fact, blue helmets is kind of like a synonym for peacekeepers around the world. So the United Nations was established on October 24th, 1945. This is right after World War II ended, and it was decided to headquarter this new organization in New York City, where it still remains to the present day. This is the UN building. All right, now let's go back to Germany for a moment. So the crimes committed by the Nazis in World War II were in many ways unprecedented. Certainly there had been massacres and even examples of genocide before the Nazis, but their level, their organization of murder and conquest was just, again, on a whole new level. And so it was decided to do something new and unique, and that was to have trials and charge these surviving Nazis with war crimes. They chose the city of Nuremberg in Germany for a couple of reasons. One, it had a courthouse that was still actually standing, which was a rare thing to find because Germany had been flattened by Allied bombers. And two, it was also kind of a symbolic site in that Nuremberg had been basically the Nazi ideological capital. It wasn't the political capital, of course, but this is where Hitler would have his great big rallies. Hitler would come out of this door here, walk down the steps, give a big speech, and they would have these big choreographed moments and military parades and all kinds of stuff. And again, this is like the Nazi heartland, Nuremberg. So it makes sense to, I guess, choose that place to try these top Nazis. By the way, in case you're curious, this building does still exist, although obviously minus the swastika. That was destroyed after the war by American forces, I believe. And there's the remnants of the building today. So from 1945 to 1946, 23 nations held what's known as an International Military Tribunal, and they put these Nazi war criminals on trial. Once again, I know I keep saying this, but this was truly unprecedented. Before, conquerors and people like Napoleon, for example, had never been put on trial. He may have been punished for his, he'd been exiled, of course, Napoleon was. But the idea of actually having a court proceeding where you present evidence, you have witnesses, and you have a jury of sorts in the form of these military judges, that's pretty unique. And what crimes to charge them with was also new and unique. They were charged with waging a war of aggression, which if you look at human history, that's pretty much all what humans have done since the beginning of time. But we're taking the step by saying that's no longer acceptable. Invading a country just because you want it and you want to conquer it and take whatever you want from it, that's no longer an acceptable reason to go to war. That's what we're saying with this this charge. The other one is also really interesting. It's crimes against humanity. So the argument is that your crimes are so awful, so deadly, so over the top that they're a crime against all humans everywhere, against the very species. You've done something so horrible. Now, some of the Nazi defendants pushed back on this by saying, well, how can you charge me with something that wasn't technically a crime beforehand? You know, you can't. How can you charge someone retroactively for so-called crimes against humanity? But we weren't really interested in what the Nazis had to say, and so we're going to put them on trial. Not every single one of them were found guilty, and not all of them were sent to death, but 12 of the 22 defendants were in fact sentenced to death. Some got lesser sentences of life, or even lower, I think like 20 years or something like that. But the important thing is we've set a precedent that in the future, if you are going to be a dictator or an aggressor and you're going to abuse people and invade other countries and commit horrible crimes, we will hold you accountable. One day you'll fall from power. We will arrest you. We will put you on trial, and you will pay the price for these actions. All right, last thing to look at, guys, is just kind of a quick assessment of the war itself. So World War II is the second deadliest conflict in American history. 1 million Americans were either killed or wounded in this war. In terms of deaths, I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, but it's right around 500,000, maybe a little bit less than that, were killed. Again, second only to the American Civil War. However, our mainland was unscathed. Unlike, say, the Soviet Union, where cities were leveled and there were literally millions of civilians who were killed, or even Britain, where they had massive destruction from German air raids, there was nothing like that in the United States. There was no equivalent to that at all. And this is really interesting because this is a theme we're going to look at in the 1950s. Europe and Asia are going to be in the process of rebuilding. And this is something that's going to take them a decade and a half to really kind of climb out of the rubble and really kind of get back to where they were. And that whole time, America was fresh and ready to go. We were the only nuclear power. Our economy was second to none. Our productive capabilities were second to none. Our prosperity is going to return. The Great Depression is just now a faint memory in the background. And so America is going to find itself with a solid decade or more where it is the true world power. The Soviet Union was, of course, in second place, but it was a distant second place in many ways. And this was, really the kind of the boom times, the golden age of America, the 1950s. And that's something we're going to look at a lot in our next unit, Period 8. So that is it for Period 7. We have covered so much ground in Period 7. And when we started with looking at things like imperialism, we talked about the progressives, we looked at the Great Depression, obviously in the 1920s as well, and World War I, I can't forget about that. And then we finished up by looking at World War II, and that is just a ton of information to look over. So in preparation for your test, make sure you really go back and look over the key people and events. Look for trends of causes and effects. That's always a key topic we focus on with our assessment of history knowledge. All right, that's it, guys, and I will see you in our next video so we can start our next big unit. Period 8 will be our final large unit of the year because Period 9 is relatively small compared to the rest of them. So one more big mountain to climb in Period 8.